Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Some good news, but not good. Deadline same has been all along. Quizzes part 1, deadline in 5, September 18th. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, deadline 5, October 16th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline November 15th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, deadline 5, December 4th. And exam number 5, deadline 5 is December 11th at noon. For the paper, if you want to do a draft, deadline for that is November 16th. The +5 bonus, November 18th. For full credit, November 25th. And for half, December 4th. Before pressing on to the stuff for today, any stuff about any previous stuff that needs more stuff? Okay, so last time we're looking at the argument basics stuff. And one thing that I did is that I put up on, if you go onto Blackboard, there's like an interactive tutorial thingy covering the argument stuff. And so if you go, it's put it in place of class from last time. Just click on that and it'll go through. And they actually have a professional voice actor doing the voice for it. And it goes through and does all the argument stuff. Now, to lay out the sort of the chart of arguments, here's kind of how it goes. Now, kind of the first thing is, do you get an argument or not? And the way to tell is to ask two questions. One is, what is the point? Is the person trying to make a point? If the answer is yes, that would be the potential conclusion. The second question to ask is the person providing evidence or reasons for that? And if the answer is yes, that gives you the premise or premises. And so if you've got both the point being made and evidence for it, you would have an argument. The second thing to consider is what type of argument is it? And as we saw, there's essentially two flavors of arguments. There's the deductive and inductive. And the way you tell is this. If we got the argument, the next question is, what's the connection that's supposed to be between the premises and the conclusion? If the answer is, it's supposed to provide complete support, offering and promising that, then it would be deductive. Because what a deductive argument is supposed to do is the premises are supposed to completely guarantee the conclusion. Now, if the answer is the premises only give a probability, that if the premises were true, the conclusion is probably true, then it is inductive. So the defining characteristic of deduction is it's supposed to be such that true premises are supposed to guarantee a true conclusion. With inductive arguments, true premises are supposed to make the conclusion likely to be true, but not guaranteed. To give an example of each. A deductive argument, an example of a good one would be the Monday, Tuesday argument I gave last time, which I can update to a Wednesday, Thursday argument. And it'd be this. Premise 1, if today is Wednesday, then tomorrow is Thursday. Premise 2, today is Wednesday. Then conclusion is tomorrow is Thursday. And that'd be a deductive argument. Because looking at it, we'd see that if the premises were true, if today is Wednesday guarantees tomorrow is Thursday, and today in fact is Wednesday, we can infer that tomorrow is Thursday with certainty. With an inductive argument, though, we're dealing in probability. Even if all the premises were true, the logic is such the conclusion is not guaranteed. It's just likely. And I gave the example before about, suppose you're traveling for winter break, and you have a friend who's supposed to pick you up, and you argue with yourself with the following. Well, my friend has shown up every time before, several times they've shown up to take me to the airport, they're very reliable, they're on time consistently, therefore they'll be there to pick me up, take me to the airport, for winter break. And it'd be an inductive argument because even if all that's true, your friend is very reliable, they've always shown up in the past, et cetera, the conclusion is not guaranteed. Very likely, but not guaranteed. The person get a flat tire, could oversleep, It could be a storm that day, the roads could be closed, etc. And so with deduction, it's supposed to be a guarantee, a 100% connection between premises and conclusion. With inductive arguments, though, they just promise probability. And as we saw, if you've got a deductive argument that's doing what it's supposed to, it's what's known as valid. And a valid argument is such that if all the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. Like the Wednesday, Thursday argument I gave. Now, if an argument has got bad logic, it's invalid. It could have all true premises and still yield a false conclusion. Like, for example, last time I gave the example of the Sopchoppy example. If Sopchoppy is the capital of Florida, then it's in Florida, which is true. Tallahassee is in Florida, Sopchoppy is in Florida, which is true. Therefore, Sopchoppy is the capital, not true. So it's taking us from true to false. So it'd be bad reasoning, an invalid argument. Now, if an argument is valid, and it really does have all true premises, like my Wednesday, Thursday argument given today, it would be sound. If it's valid but the premises are not all true, then it'd be unsound. Invalid arguments, of course, are always unsound, because sound means valid in all true premises. Now, with the inductive arguments, they don't deal in certainty, they deal in probability. So, if the truth of the premises makes it likely the conclusion is true, likely enough, it would be strong. And if the premises being true would make it not so likely that the conclusion is true, it would be weak. And these come in degrees. Some arguments are stronger than others. For example, the example you had last time, suppose it's true that 80% of humans have brown eyes. And you infer that the next person through the door will have brown eyes. In that case, it's a pretty strong argument because your chance of being right is 80%. Pretty good. Now, if someone is to infer that the next person through the door would not have brown eyes, they only have a 20% chance of being right, making it a weak or bad argument. Now, if you have an argument that is inductive and strong, and all the premises are true, it's what's typically called cogent. So that's the chart of arguments. As mentioned before, if you go on Blackboard, you go into the videos, there's amazingly enough a professionally done video, done courtesy of the folks at Blackboard. I work with them over the summer, that lays this all out with a professional voice actor. I don't mean like a big name. We don't have like Benedict Cumberbatch or Angelina Jolie doing it. But someone paid to do voicing things. I don't know if they've done anything else or not. Before.
The C word, what is it? Can you pronounce it again?
Oh, code, this one?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, let me. Cogent.
Cogent.
Go ahead. Okay, so last time we said a bit about the deductive arguments, what they are, valid, unsound, or unsound. Now, as I mentioned before, with the deductive arguments, you'll probably never need them again in this class. They won't bring them up explicitly in the arguments. And in your paper, you can do your entire paper without using any deductive arguments. The main reason why I include this is so if I do mention deduction, you'll know what I mean. And also, if you never take a philosophy class ever again, at least you'll know what deduction is, which may be useful someday. And I included in the notes examples of various deductive arguments. And rather than read them, actually, I'll just not do that. Before pressing to, we'll focus on primarily the inductive arguments. Anything about the deductive that needs more deductive stuff?
You said for deductive it's either valid or invalid, and if all the premises are true, then it's sound.
Yes, if you have a valid argument, if it's deductive and valid, and it has all true premises, then it's sound. And the reason why is because, by definition, a sound argument means, by definition, valid plus all true premises.
And what is unsound? That means that all premises are true, but the conclusion is not sound.
Well, unsound can occur different ways. One way for an argument to be unsound, it could be unsound, it could be valid, but not have all true premises. Like the Monday, Tuesday argument is valid today, but it's not sound today because today's Wednesday, not Monday.
Okay.
So that would be an unsound argument today. On Monday, it'll be sound again. You can also have an argument be unsound by being invalid. So if it's invalid, it would be unsound. And you can have it both. You can have an argument that's unsound because it's invalid and its premises are not all true. So if you know an argument's sound, you know it's got all the premises, you know it's valid, you know it's deductive, you know it's an argument. If you know an argument is unsound, could be valid, could be invalid. If the term is used properly, you know it's deductive, and you know it's an argument, but you don't know whether it's valid or invalid.
Okay.
Can you give another example other than the Thursday, Wednesday?
Oh, of a sound.
Yeah.
Sound. Oh, easy to know something like this. If I am an English professor, then I must have a doctor. I must have a degree in English. I don't have a degree in English, therefore I'm not an English professor. And it'd be, a valid argument. The reasoning is good, and I think that it's sound because I don't think you're allowed to teach without like a degree. So in that case, you'd have a definitely valid and probably sound. Anything else? Now, the main thing we'll focus on throughout the rest of part one is inductive reasoning, and specifically looking at inductive reasoning, obviously in the context of ethics and morality. As we saw, an inductive argument is such that it deals in probability. The premises connection to the conclusion does not give certainty. It's such that if all the premises were true, the conclusion is supposed to be very likely to be true, but not guaranteed. Now, to illustrate why this is the case, the reason is because of what's called the inductive leap. Here's the idea. Now, one sort of inductive argument you probably wouldn't use in your paper, is what's called a generalization. A good example of it is a political survey. For example, if you follow politics at all, we've got the Trump, we've got the Bernie, we've got the Hillary, and they're all battling to see who's going to be the Republican nominee, who's going to be the Democrat nominee, and then they'll battle to see who's going to be the president. And of course, the people in the media need something to talk about, so they're looking at how they're going. And the way they do that, of course, is by surveys and polls. And so here you've got all the potential voters in the United States, millions of people, but of course it's a lot of people to ask. So you couldn't really go and call them all up or track them all down and say, hey, who are you going to vote for in the primaries, who are you going to vote for like in a general election. So what they do is they pull out samples. So for example, recently they might do a poll in Iowa and ask Iowa voters during the primary, who are you going to vote for? And they might say Ben Carson, certain percentage for the Donald, others for, Rubio and Cruz and Jeb. And then what we do is we'd say, well, here's our sample, the people, we polled. We want to know not just about the sample, we want to know about the whole population. So what we'll do is we'll generalize from our observed sample to the whole population. We'll make a jump from what we know to what we don't know. And the leap is basically going from what you know about, this many people, to the whole population. And of course, whenever you're trying to jump something, things can go wrong. You might not make the leap. And so there's always a gap with an inductive argument between your premises and your conclusion. You're always making some type of leap. Like, for example, the brown eye thing. 80% chance of brown eyes, but there's still a 20% chance of not. There's the leap, so it may not make it across. Another example, like with the example I gave, your reliable friend who's supposed to come take you to the airport, so you can go someplace, for winter break. What you're going from is the past, and you're leaping to the future, from what has been to what will be. And as, whenever people are selling stocks, they always say, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. So when you leap from the past to the future, where we've observed what's happening next, we could always be wrong. So inductive arguments, they involve probability, and the reason for this is because there's always that leap. We're going beyond our premises. Now a good question might be, so why don't we just stick with deduction? Because that's got certainty. Well, the reason why is, of course, is that much of the reason we have to do is by its very nature inductive. Predicting the future is not, as far as you know, not deductive. Doing the generalizations. I mean, you can make it deductive if you check everybody, 100%, but we don't really have the time or money for that. As I mentioned, inductive arguments are assessed in terms of being strong and weak. Now with deductive arguments, if you've taken critical thinking or the logic class, we can test those for being valid or invalid with neat things like truth tables. Putting in some put up some truth tables, or we can do some diagrams, do a little shading, etc. We don't cover any of that stuff because it's way beyond the purpose of the course. But with inductive arguments, there's no exact test like that. You can't do a table, you can't do a Venn diagram. So what do? Well, to use a crappy analogy, if deduction is just like doing math, which it is, judging inductive arguments is more like judging, say, Olympic diving or Olympic figure skating. There are definite standards by which to judge, but there's not a precise, it's not like, track where you have a time, you have a clock. First person across the line, they win because they are faster. In this case, the judgment is based on a set of standards and how well the argument meets those standards, which makes it, a bit more fuzzy. So with every inductive argument, you have to look at the argument itself and its standards to see what makes a good one or bad one. But the general concepts remain. A strong one is such that the reasoning is good, meaning that if the premises were true, the conclusion would be probably true. If it's weak, it means that the conclusion is not likely to be true. Now this is, in a way, kind of fuzzy because, in terms of what is the exact cutoff between strong and weak, well, kind of fuzzy. In professional context, for example, people doing scientific experiments and polls, they have a definite cutoff. For example, kind of the gold standard in professional polls is 95% confidence, with a margin of error typically around 3 to 4%. Similarly, like when people do, if you are in the sciences at all, you probably, if you're especially something like psychology, you have various confidence in your results. And those are expressed as basically the strength, which is essentially a fancy way of saying, here's how likely that, given my evidence, assuming it's correct, that my conclusion is right. And there's all kinds of math stuff for that, but we won't cover that because that's way beyond our purposes. Now, before we're going to look at 3 useful inductive arguments, anything about the stuff so far that needs more stuff? Now, the 3 arguments we look at now are all inductive, so it means that they deal in probability. If the premises are true and they're put together correctly, that means that the conclusion is probably true. And these are 3 good inductive arguments. And we'll look at them, what they are, look at the form, and look at how to assess them, and also look at how to use them during moral argumentation. Our first one is the much feared analogical argument, or argument by or from analogy. Now, if you get an analogy, what have you got? Should you be afraid? if someone says like, oh, there's an analogy in the house with you, so you run from the house screaming? Possibly. No, an analogy is just what? If you're drawing an analogy, you're doing a comparison. Apples to oranges, cats to dogs, whatever. You're saying one thing is like something else. Now we do a variety of analogies that are arguments. For example, there are analogies that are intended to explain. We might say, explain, for example, how the heart works by drawing an analogy to a pump. Or it might explain how the eye works by drawing an analogy to a camera. And those are explanatory analogies. They're not arguing, they're just explaining. We also have what are called persuasive or rhetorical analogies, where you compare one thing to another, not to prove something, but to make people feel a certain way. For example, the Republican candidates who are running for office, they want to draw an analogy between themselves and, well, who's been the greatest Republican president of all time? Yeah, Ronald Reagan. So you'll hear pretty much every Republican candidate trying to say how they're like Ronald Reagan. And the idea being is that Ronald Reagan is great, they're like Reagan, so the idea is to persuade people into thinking they're great. Now, of course, the opposite thing, if you want to imply or make a negative comparison between a person, but the worst person you can pick is who?
Bush.
Well, if you're pretending your politics, but historically it's been, if you want to go full on, evil comparison. Yeah, Hitler. Go full, go on full Hitler. You say someone is like Hitler. And people have compared, President Obama to Hitler, Bush to Hitler, etc. And the idea is, rhetoric. This person is like Hitler. They also do with the Nazi thing. This is like Nazis. And the idea, of course, Nazis are bad. You shouldn't like Nazis, so you shouldn't like that. But those are just persuasive or rhetorical analogies. Just saying that someone is like Reagan doesn't mean they're good. Saying that the person is like Hitler, comparing them, doesn't mean they're actually like that or really bad. The next sort of analogy that's not an argument is used in, well, art, metaphors and similes and stuff. So when someone says that Juliet is the sun, arise, fair sun, and slay the envious moon, they're not saying that Juliet is a sphere of burning gas undergoing hydrogen fusion. They're saying, Juliet's like all hot and stuff. And of course that's an analogy as well, that she's all pretty and stuff. And so that is an analogy, but not an argument. So what is the actual argument by analogy? Well, the actual argument informally works like this. It's when you take one thing that you establish something about, you say it's like this other thing, and because these two things are alike in certain ways, they're alike in another way that you're concerned with. To be more formal, here's the strict form. Now, in general, except for philosophers, people don't talk like this. They just compare things. They say this is like this in these ways, therefore it's like this in other ways. But, just like with mathematics and sciencey stuff, it's useful to lay out the strict formula, to see like how it's used strictly, and then of course in normal writing, you'd write it out pretty much more informally. You wouldn't typically do this, unless you want to be really precise. So here's how you build a informal analogy. It consists of 3 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. And what you're doing is you're comparing the two things. So premise 1, X has properties P, Q, and R. X is like whatever thing you're talking about. And the properties P, Q, and R are whatever properties you're concerned with. And these are just, variables and placeholders. It won't always be 3, it might be like a lot more, maybe less. But you're basically saying X has certain properties. Premise 2, you establish that the second thing you're concerned with has the same properties. So basically in premise 1 and 2 you're saying X and Y are alike. They have these qualities in common. Premise 3, you state that X has a certain property as well, property Z, whatever property you're concerned with. Therefore, Y has Z as well. Put a little less formally, the idea is this. X and Y are alike. X has this quality. Therefore, Y has that quality. Now, analogies can be quite literal, where you are comparing things just very exactly. For example, when we want to know if a new product is dangerous to humans, what do we start testing it on?
Animals.
Yeah, animals, because animals don't have lawyers, typically. So suppose we want to know suppose we have this new pharmaceutical that supposedly is designed to treat a particular condition. Say something like angry spleen. I just made that up. And what we do, of course, is we find something like humans. So we'd say rats have certain qualities. You know, mammals, hearts, lungs, eyes, blood, you know, kidneys, etc., etc. Premise 2, humans have properties, similar properties. We're mammals, hearts, lungs, spines, kidneys, pancreas, spleen, etc. And suppose when we test the drug on the rats, they spontaneously explode. They just blow up. Rats everywhere. Now, in that case, we infer what? Yeah, you probably want to go to market because this will probably blow up people. Unless you want to market it as a weapon, which could be very profitable. So the idea is people like rats, this makes rats explode, it'll make people explode as well. Now, of course, it's an argument by analogy, so it's inductive, which means all this could be true, but this could turn out to be false. Because there are things that are like in many ways, and you would infer that, well, we're like in all these ways, so this should apply as well, but it turns out it doesn't, because of the inductive leap, because there may be differences that, well, make a difference. For example, we're a lot like dogs. We're very similar. We're mammals, you know, we have a similar, you know, inner structure. They, you know, we get a heart, they get a heart, we get kidneys, they get a kidney, we get pancreas, they get pancreas, we get a liver, they get a liver. We're very alike. We can safely eat chocolate, and onions, and avocados, and macadamia nuts, and grapes, and of course raisins, because raisins are just dried grapes. And we might infer, well, all that stuff will be safe for dogs, because they're like us. But all that stuff is bad for dogs. Chocolate's bad for them, avocados is bad for them, onions is bad for them, grapes are bad for them. And it's not going to like kill them instantly. It's not like your dog's going to like explode if it gets a hold of a grape or something. But all that stuff is bad for them. You know, safe for us mostly, but bad for them. Because even though we're very similar, we have some differences. And fortunately, in some of these cases, one thing that we don't get, which dogs do, is heartworm, which is really good. Because if you have a dog, heartworm's really bad. Fortunately, we don't get that, because that would be heartworm is exactly as horrifying as it sounds like. Mosquitoes carry these little worms in them, little larvae. When it bites the dog, it gets in their bloodstream, grows up, and they live in the heart, in the lungs. And that, of course, is bad. Fortunately, we don't get them as far as we know. And so mosquitoes can bite us all they want. We get other stuff, like dengue fever, yellow fever, and malaria, but we don't get heartworms. So, and there's probably some things that dogs don't get that we get. So everybody gets screwed in different ways. Now, how can this be used, you know, in ethical argumentation? Well, the formula is pretty straightforward, and the approach is pretty straightforward. Well, what you do typically, if you want to show something is, say, good or bad, a very straightforward way to do it is this. You take something that's already accepted as good, or accepted as being something bad, and then you show how the two things are like. So if you already shown that X is something bad, and you show that Y has the same qualities, then you can infer that Y is also bad, or good as the case may be. For example, suppose you picked as your subject the ethics of using animals for food and experiments in clothing. And you wanted to argue by analogy that using animals for food and clothing is wrong. And here's how you could do it, with a little drama to it. Now suppose I walked in eating a delicious smelling sandwich, you know, full of meat, you know, barbecue and stuff, and gnawing on it, and someone says, "Oh, that sandwich smells so good, what is it? And I said, oh, you know, my neighbors are giving me a lot of trouble. Finally get sick of it, and so I killed them. And I thought, you know, look, all that delicious meat, you can't let that meat go to waste. You know, I grew up, you know, hunting. If you kill something, you gotta eat it. So I figured, you know, try out that barbecue recipe, put a little barbecue sauce on them, slow cook them for a while, peel off that delicious meat, put it on the sandwich. But of course they also have skin. You can't waste the skin, you gotta use every part of the animal. So, you know, got this nice belt made out of my neighbor, these nice shoes, also neighbor. Plus, you know, I made this, you know, wash thing, looks like metal, but it's actually bone, you know, because got to use all the parts. And the stand for my little camera there, also bone, because you got to use all the parts. Now in that case, of course, we think that was horrifying, because, you know, eating people, we think is wrong. And making them into belts and boots and stuff, and camera stands, is super horrible. Now, if we accept that eating people is wrong, well, we could say, well, if I just say, oh, I'm just kidding, it's, you know, just cow, and this is cow, and that's, you know, dead dinosaur, plastic, we say, oh, we're relieved. But if you want to make a more argument, say, well, people are like animals. It's wrong to eat people. Therefore, it's wrong to eat animals. And people who are vegetarians, sometimes, but not always, make that argument. They make the moral argument, well, they're like us. We shouldn't eat people, so we shouldn't eat animals. And this is an extremely useful thing. So in general, if someone says, I don't know how to argue, you know, someone being good or bad, one very straightforward way to do it, the easy argument is, find something that is like what you want to argue about. If you want to argue that it's good, find something like it that is already generally accepted as good, or something that's generally accepted as bad. And things that are generally accepted as bad would include things like cannibalism. Pretty much everyone's against cannibalism, as a general rule. Another example, you could use, well, you could take an example like arguing against war. Now, suppose that I gaze over at my neighbor's yard, and I see that the grass, in fact, is greener over there. And so I decide I must conquer their backyard. So I drive to Walmart, which is, of course, your one-stop shop for neighborhood conquest. I get a, you know, riding lawnmower, some metal plates, a welding kit, you know, some shotguns, ammunition, you know, loudspeakers, MP3 player. Okay, you got to get the, if you're going to go on a ride of conquest, you got to play the Ride of the Valkyries. Have you ever seen Apocalypse Now? You're flying in helicopters, playing the Ride of the Valkyries. If you haven't seen it, you can just go on YouTube, put in Apocalypse Now, Ride of the Valkyries. You'll be glad you did. Maybe, probably not, but it's cool. And so I get home, put it all together, make my little backyard tank with the shotguns on it, go over, boom, boom, neighbor's dead, take their stuff, you know, expanded my yard. Now, would murdering my neighbors to take their yard, would that probably be wrong? Yeah, because in general, murdering people and taking their stuff, wrong. So what's the analogy going to be to? Well, if, you know, murdering my neighbors and taking their stuff is wrong, and war is like that, and war is typically going over, you know, not, you know, the neighbor like right across the fence, so to speak, but a neighbor, typically, and going over and killing them and taking their stuff. Well, if it's wrong for me to do it to my neighbor with my little, you know, lawnmower and shotgun and stuff, then it'd be wrong to go and do that to another country. Therefore, that sort of war would be, by analogy, wrong. So it's a pretty useful method. So again, the approach is basically this. I want to show that something is good or something is bad. Go and find something that's similar, or think of something similar that is generally accepted as good or generally accepted as bad. Build the analogy, problem solved, one argument out of the way. Now, how do you tell when you've got a good one of these? So how do you build one so it's good? Or if you're criticizing it, how do you try to show that it's bad? Well, this also provides a map for doing the, you know, paper, because you've got argument, you know, and then an objection. So one way to object to an argument by analogy is to contend that one of the standards or more wasn't actually met. And then the way to reply back to that is argue that it did. So the argument by analogy provides a easy way to argue more. Find something similar to what you want to argue about that's accepted as good or bad, generally. Draw the analogy, lay out why it's a good one, consider an objection as to why it's not a good analogy, reply back as to why it's actually good. Done. Problem solved. So what do you look for in a good analogy? Well, there are three standards. First, the number of properties the two things have in common. Are there enough points of comparison? And that's important because an argument by analogy works by saying these two things are alike in these ways, so they're alike in this other way. So the more they have in common, the better. Now, of course, merely having stuff in common is just one of the factors. Because you can have things that have stuff in common. The next question, though, is, are those shared qualities actually relevant to what you're talking about? For example, suppose that, let's use a stupid example to illustrate this. Suppose I write this out. Cannibalism, pancake. And I'll say you notice there's a lot of similarity between cannibalism and pancakes. You notice a C, an A, an A, an A, an A, an S, an S. Lots of similarities. Cannot be denied. Cannibalism is clearly wrong. Therefore, since they have all these letters in common, pancakes are clearly morally wrong. Now that's an argument. Premises have been offered, there is a conclusion. It's an argument by analogy. And they do have, several properties in common. Both involve eating, things to be eaten, and they have a lot of letters in common. But are those qualities relevant?
No.
No, that's just clearly stupid. So it fails on the second one. They do have properties in common, but these qualities are clearly not relevant. Now the third standard kind of connects to the second one, except it goes the opposite way. Namely, are there any relevant dissimilarities that break the comparison? So these three basically boil down to, are the two things alike enough in number and relevance for the analogy to be good? The more alike they are, and the more ways they're alike, the more relevant it is, better. The less things they have in common, the worse. The less the properties are relevant they have in common, the worse. And the more relevant dissimilarities, the worse. Now, how does the relevance and of similarities and dissimilarities work? Well, let's go back to my analogy between eating and people. Get a little bite out of that person's head. There we go. And eating, say, cow. Have your own cow. Actually, let's go with a pig. It looks more like a pig. Squiggly tail.
It's pretty good.
And a little bite out of him. So, why is this not okay? And why would this be okay? Well, one way to break the analogy would be to say that there are relevant dissimilarities between Mr. Person and Miss Piggy. Not Piggy, but Pig there. And one thing you could say is, well, human beings have a higher moral status. We have, we're human, we have reason, we have feelings, etc. And so you could argue that there are relevant differences. We have qualities the pig lacks, and this is a relevant dissimilarity that makes it okay to, make a barbecue pork sandwich, but not a barbecue person sandwich, or BPS. So in ordering a BPS, be sure to specify pork, not people. So we could argue there's relevant dissimilarities. People differ from pigs in ways, that makes it okay to eat the pigs. Now, the challenge, of course, is showing why those similarities or dissimilarities are relevant. Now, but suppose your position is that you shouldn't eat pigs or people. What you could do is you could say, well, one objection might be that it's okay to eat pigs and not people because people are different, because people are better than pigs. And so we can't, it's wrong to eat us. Now, what could be replied back is to try to argue that those differences really aren't relevant, or really don't make a difference. One could say back, well, it's true that humans are human and they're smarter than pigs, but imagine a human is not very smart. Let's take an infant. 1 day old. Let's take a pig, adult pig. Who is smarter? Pig. But can we eat babies? No. Even though they're not smart, we shouldn't be eating them because they're living creatures. And so we could argue, well, pigs are alive. We don't think we should eat babies. So by going back to the analogy, we shouldn't eat pigs either. So that would be an example of an original argument about my barbecue people argument. Then an objection, well, pigs are inferior to people, so we can eat them. And then reply back, well, some people are comparable to pigs, but we don't think we should eat them either. So the analogy still would hold. So that's the argument by analogy and how to assess it. And an example of how you could argue, object, reply. Now before, in our remaining time, going on to our second argument, argument by example, anything about argument by analogy that needs any more stuff?
Can you go back to the previous slide and provide another example that follows the strict form?
Sure.
I'm still not.
Certainly. We could take, let's take an argument by analogy, arguing for equal pay, for equal work. We could say men have certain properties. Human, we have, hearts, lungs, etc., education, skills, work, etc. And suppose you get a woman that has comparable properties. Analogous education, analogous experience, analogous quality of work, etc. The man gets paid Z dollars. Therefore, by analogy, the woman should be paid Z dollars as well. The man is like the woman, the man is paid this much, the woman should be paid that much as well. So we can argue by analogy for pay equity. Now someone could argue, to continue the example, someone could argue against it and say there are relevant differences, that men deserve more pay because they're men. And people do make that argument. And then people reply back, well, although things like experience and education and quality of work matter, merely being male doesn't seem relevant to the pay. It's like, well, I've got a prostate, therefore I deserve more money. That does not seem to follow. Even though prostate and pay both have a letter P.
So what kind of argument would that be? The example that you provided, would it be like a deductive argument or an
the comparison between the men, that would be an argument. This would be an inductive argument by analogy. The man has the following qualities: education, experience, job quality. The woman in question has the same education, experience, and job quality. The man is paid this much. Therefore, by analogy, the woman should be paid that much as well. And the way to counter that would be to try to show that there's a dissimilarity between the man and the woman. And the question would be, would it be relevant? Because someone would say, well, the obvious dissimilarity is this is a dude, this is a dudette, but therefore they should be paid less. Then the question would be, is that really a relevant difference? Does having a prostate entail that one deserves more pay? And the answer, considering, would seem to be, well, is that relevant? Does that improve a person's, pay deservedness? And the answer seems to be no. I mean, you could look at things that would be relevant, something like if you have the man has more experience, more education, better quality of work, then sure, those would be relevant differences. But if the difference is just, one's a man, one's a woman, you'd say, well, those don't seem to be relevant. Now, as you might imagine, there can be considerable debate of what's actually relevant and what's not. There are, I'm sure as you know, there are people who think merely being male means that you are entitled to more of everything. Or you can also do the same thing with, obviously, like race. You can have, take two different ethnicities, put them in there, and people will say, well, if this person's lighter, they deserve more money, which clearly does not follow. So that would be the argument by analogy. Does that help at all?
Yes.
Good. Success. Now the next one we'll look at, and I'll just lay out sort of the setup for it. Next time we'll take a look at the argument, next one will be the argument from example. The basic idea is this. An argument by example, shockingly and amazingly enough, is when you argue by giving examples. This, of course, can be used outside of philosophy as well. For example, when people are running for office, one thing they'll try to do is establish that they are, say, good decision makers, or that they have foreign policy experience. And one way they'll do this is by an argument by example. If they say they're a good decision maker, they'll try to give examples of good decisions being made. If someone claims the contrary, that they're a bad decision maker, they'll try to argue by example, giving examples of bad decision making. Or if someone claims they have foreign policy experience, they'll try to give examples of foreign policy experience to support that claim. Or if someone says that they lack it, they'll try to show that those examples don't work. Now, as you might imagine, in normal everyday life, people don't go through, premise 1, premise 2, etc. They're kind of informal. They'll just say, here's some examples that, they show my claim is true. The form is this, then we'll close here. What you do basically is you give examples. Example 1 supports the claim. Example 2 supports the claim. Example 3 supports the claim. Therefore, the claim is true. Oh, typo here. This should be so typo. And for example, someone might say, take Hillary Clinton. She's already for foreign policy experience. She might just give all our examples being Secretary of State. She went to Libya. She went to Germany, she went to Australia, she went to Canada, she went to New Jersey, all those foreign policy experience things. Therefore, she concludes she has foreign policy experience. So next time we'll pick up an argument from by example with more stuff.